I've always felt most alive with the wind against my face and a path unwinding under my wheels. After months of planning, today was the day I'd embark on my solo journey through the Scottish Highlands. My bicycle, equipped with all essentials for an 8-day trek, stood ready outside my small flat in Aberfoyle village. The thrill of adventure pulsed through me as I loaded the last of my camping gear, eager to find solitude and untamed wilderness. Leaving behind the quaint village, I cycled towards the less trodden paths leading into Queen Elizabeth Park. The sky was a brooding overcast, typical of a Scottish summer, threatening rain, but holding back just enough to let me enjoy the beginning of my trek. The air was crisp, and every breath seemed to draw the wild scent of wet earth and pine deeper into my lungs. The first few miles were familiar, a well-ridden trail that many locals frequented. But soon, the comforting sounds of distant cars and chatter faded, replaced by the singular noise of my bike's tires crunching over rough, uneven ground. I was heading deeper into isolation, the dense forest swallowing the path and filtering the daylight into a haunting twilight. As the terrain grew wilder, the real challenge began. The path narrowed, winding through thickets of ferns and towering trees that obscured my view of what lay ahead. Each pedal stroke took me further into the heart of the wilderness, and with each mile, the weight of my solitude grew heavier. I had sought this isolation, yet there was an undeniable thrill mixed with apprehension at being so utterly alone. By late afternoon, I decided to set up my first camp. I found a small clearing, seemingly untouched and surrounded by the dense forest. As I pitched my tent and prepared a modest dinner, the silence of the highlands enveloped me. It was a profound quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and distant calls of hidden birds. Nightfall came swiftly, the dark amplifying the remoteness of my campsite. Lying in my tent, the fatigue of the day's ride began to ease, and my thoughts drifted to the days ahead. But as sleep crept upon me, a subtle sound prickled at my awareness, something or someone moving just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or a small animal curious about my presence. But as the night deepened, the sounds grew more distinct, an unsettling rustle, and the faintest hint of footsteps. My heart raced as I considered the possibilities, each more unnerving than the last. Was I truly as alone as I thought? Morning couldn't come soon enough, and with it, my resolve hardened. This was the adventure I had sought, and a few mysterious sounds in the night wouldn't deter me. Yet, as I packed up my camp, I couldn't shake off the eerie feeling that something had watched me through the night. The real journey, I realized, was just beginning. As I mounted my bike and glanced back at the dense forest, a chill ran down my spine. What secrets did these ancient woods hold? With a deep breath, I pedaled forward, the wilderness beckoning me deeper into its embrace. As dawn broke over the Scottish Highlands, the uneasy feelings from the night lingered, but I was determined not to let them overshadow my adventure. With a renewed spirit, I packed up my camp and set off deeper into the wilderness. The path ahead was rugged, the true essence of remote Scotland unfolding with each pedal stroke. The thrill of the unknown propelled me forward, despite the lingering echoes of last night's disturbances. By mid-morning, I had reached a particularly secluded part of the forest. The trees here grew so close together, they almost seemed to whisper secrets to each other, the canopy casting deep shadows that chilled the air beneath. It was here, in a small, oddly symmetrical clearing, that I decided to take a break. Dismounting, I stretched my legs and explored the area, curiosity guiding my steps. It was then that I stumbled upon it, an arrangement of stones that looked unnervingly like a grave. A circle of moss-covered rocks with a flat stone in the center lay undisturbed, as if guarding the solitude of this place. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. Drawn by a mix of fear and fascination, I approached, inspecting the central stone. It was unlike the others, smoother and marked with faint, indecipherable carvings that seemed ancient. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this a historical site, forgotten by time? or something more sinister. The logical part of my mind urged caution, but the adventurer in me was intrigued. I took out my camera and snapped a few photos, thinking they might be of interest to a local historian. Yet, as I touched the stone, a cold unease settled over me, as if the air around had thickened with silent warning. Shaking off the feeling, I decided it was time to move on. As I continued my journey, the forest seemed to close in around me. The air grew still, and the path became even more isolating. Every rustle in the underbrush felt amplified, every shadow a lurking threat. My heart pounded not just from the exertion, but also from a growing sense of dread. That night, I chose a campsite with more care, setting up in a clearer area with fewer trees. As darkness enveloped the wilderness, the sounds began again, this time more pronounced. The rustling seemed deliberate, as if something, or someone, was moving with a purpose around my tent. Lying there, my thoughts spiraled. The stone arrangement, the eerie sensations, the unsettling noises, they all wove together into a tapestry of fear. I strained to hear over the pounding of my own heart, wondering if the wind was playing tricks on me, or if my presence had disturbed something best left alone. Sleep proved elusive. Every crack and whisper of the forest seemed to speak of hidden watchers. By the time morning light filtered through the trees, I was weary but resolute. The wilderness might be testing me, but I wouldn't yield. Packing up my camp with hurried movements, I prepared to leave this place, driven by a desire to distance myself from the unnerving experiences. As I cycled away, the forest seemed to watch me go, the trees standing like silent sentinels. Despite the daylight, the weight of unseen eyes followed, a reminder that in the wilderness, one is never truly alone. My journey was far from over, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there might be just beginning to take an interest in me. With each pedal stroked deeper into the heart of the Scottish wilderness, the sense of isolation intensified. The narrow paths wound through increasingly dense forests, where the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above. It was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. This seclusion, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. The isolation I had once sought now weighed heavily upon me, a tangible presence that accompanied me along the winding trail. The occurrences of the previous nights had left their mark on my psyche. As dusk approached, I found a relatively open spot to set up camp, one that offered a clear view of the surrounding area. I needed the reassurance of visibility, a small comfort against the growing unease. Yet even in this openness, the sounds of the forest seemed to close in, each rustle of leaves and snap of a twig echoing like whispers across the landscape. That night, the disturbances escalated. The rustling around my tent became more pronounced, more purposeful. It was as if whatever lurked in the shadows had grown bolder, less concerned with concealing its presence. I lay in my tent, heart racing, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. The noises circled the tent, a soft, dragging sound followed by a distinct pause, as if it, or they, were waiting for my reaction. With morning came a brief respite. The light seemed to banish the worst of my fears, rendering them products of the night's imagination. Yet the relief was fleeting. As I packed up my gear, the sense of being watched was palpable. The feeling of eyes upon me was so intense it raised the hairs on the back of my neck, urging me to hurry. As I continued my journey, the physical challenges of the terrain became more demanding. Steep inclines followed by sudden dips tested my endurance and cycling skills. The exertion should have distracted me, yet it only heightened my other senses. Each pause to catch my breath filled the silence with distant, unplaceable sounds, further feeding my anxiety. The isolation of the path I had chosen was complete. No fellow hikers crossed my path, no distant voices carried through the trees. There was only me, my bike, and an increasingly oppressive sense of something unseen sharing my journey. This solitude was no longer a peaceful escape, but a stark vulnerability. In the afternoon, I reached a particularly dense part of the forest, where the trees arched overhead, forming a natural tunnel. The beauty of it was undeniable, yet it felt like entering the belly of a beast. The light dimmed, and the air cooled as if the forest itself was drawing in a deep, slow breath. Here, the whispers seemed to materialize from the very air. Faint at first, they grew in clarity, a murmuring that I could almost, but not quite, understand. The sound seemed to follow me, keeping pace with my every move. I stopped, heart pounding, and listened. The voices halted abruptly, as if aware of my attention. Pushed to the brink of my nerve, I made a decision. I could not spend another night like the last. With a surge of adrenaline, I mounted my bike and pedaled with renewed urgency. The path ahead was unclear, shrouded in the natural gloom of the overhanging trees, but my resolve was sharp. Whatever this journey held, I was determined to face it, to push through the fear and the supernatural whispers that sought to drive me back. As the shadows lengthened and another night approached, I braced myself. The eerie occurrences had not deterred me yet, and I would not let them break me now. Whatever awaited in the depths of these woods, I was ready, or so I told myself, clinging to the last remnants of my courage as the darkness closed in. As the days unfolded in the Scottish Highlands, my encounters with the unexplained grew more intense. Each night, the forest around my campsite seemed to come alive with whispers and movements that defied rational explanation. The notion of being watched had evolved from a fleeting concern to a constant, gnawing certainty. With each rustle and snap, the invisible eyes seemed to burrow deeper into my psyche. Despite my best efforts to maintain composure, the relentless presence that trailed me became an overwhelming force. I could no longer dismiss the sounds as mere coincidences of nature. They were deliberate, targeted, as if something was testing my limits, watching for any sign of weakness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows over the forest floor, I decided to confront my fears. I stepped out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and scanned the dense thicket that bordered the clearing. The light flickered across the undergrowth, catching nothing but the usual suspects of a woodland at night. Yet the sensation of being observed persisted, stronger than ever. The isolation I had once craved now felt like a trap. The vastness of the wilderness, once exhilarating, had become a labyrinth with no clear way out. Each twig snap, each leaf rustle, echoed in my mind like the taunts of a hidden adversary. That night, the disturbances around my tent intensified. It started with the familiar rustling, but soon evolved into something more menacing. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, every sense straining against the darkness. The pauses between the sounds were the worst, charged with anticipation, as if the forest itself held its breath. In a moment of desperation, I yelled into the darkness, challenging the unseen stalker. The woods fell silent, a heavy, oppressive silence that felt like a stifling blanket over the night. Then, slowly, the sounds resumed, this time encircling the tent, as though whatever was out there was drawing closer, emboldened by my fear. By dawn, I was a raw nerve. Without a moment's hesitation, I abandoned my campsite, leaving behind gear that suddenly seemed trivial compared to my need to escape. As I pedaled away, the forest seemed to watch me go, the early morning mist clinging to the trees like remnants of a bad dream. The further I rode, the more the tension built within me. Each shadow in the periphery of my vision seemed to twitch with movement. The feeling of being followed persisted, as persistent and real as the ground beneath my tires. I pushed my body to its limits, riding faster, driven by a primal urge to flee from whatever haunted these woods. By the time I stopped for a breath, the sun was high, and the light had begun to dispel the worst of my fears. But the damage was done. I could no longer deny the reality of my situation. I was being stalked, hunted by something that did not wish to be seen. As I leaned against my bike, catching my breath, I knew I had to make a decision. To continue this journey was to delve deeper into potential peril, but turning back meant admitting defeat, surrendering to the fear. With a mixture of dread and defiance, I chose to push forward, to confront whatever awaited in the depths of the forest. The unknown had always drawn me, and now it called me deeper with a voice that was impossible to ignore. Whatever the nature of my unseen stalker, I would face it head-on, armed with nothing but my resolve and the faint hope that I could outlast the terror. The forest seemed to close in around me as I pedaled deeper into its heart, the trees whispering secrets I could not understand. With each turn of the wheels, a shiver ran down my spine, my senses on high alert. The fear had rooted itself deep within me, a constant companion that whispered warnings with every rustling leaf and distant snap. As the day waned, the shadows grew long and dark, stretching across the path like fingers reaching out from the undergrowth. I knew I couldn't ride forever. Exhaustion was setting in, and the need for a camp was undeniable. But the thought of stopping, of allowing the darkness to envelop me in this haunted wilderness, was almost too much to bear. Despite my trepidation, I found a small clearing as night began to fall, a patch of ground reluctantly given up by the encroaching forest. Setting up camp was mechanical, each movement deliberate, as I tried to keep the fear at bay. My hand shook as I pitched the tent, the fabric rustling loudly in the eerie silence that had settled around me. As darkness settled, the forest seemed to awaken. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something foul and unsettling. I zipped up my tent, sealing myself in, a flimsy barrier against the night. The sounds began again, familiar yet far more terrifying than before, rustling, snapping, and now, a low guttural growl that seemed to circle the camp. I lay in my sleeping bag, clutching a flashlight, my only weapon against the dark. The noises grew closer, more insistent. Heart pounding, I braced myself, knowing that tonight something would change. I could feel it in the charged air, a climax to the haunting that had dogged my every step. Then it came, the moment I had both dreaded and anticipated. The fabric of the tent vibrated as a shadow passed, large and imposing. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly unzipped the tent, the flashlight's beam trembling in my hand. Outside, the darkness was almost complete, but the light caught something. Eyes, reflecting the light back at me. Not human, not animal, something else entirely. The figure stood on the edge of the clearing, twisted and unnatural, its form blurred as if seen through water. My heart screamed for me to run, but my body was frozen, caught between fear and fascination. It moved, a slow, jerking motion that seemed both painful and predatory. As it stepped into the light, I could see it clearly, a grotesque mockery of a human shape, limbs too long, skin a sickly pallor. It stopped just outside the reach of my light, watching me with an intensity that felt almost curious. The encounter was brief but felt like an eternity. With a suddenness that made my heart jump, the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me breathless and alone in the silent night. I didn't sleep. How could I? Dawn came, pale and unremarkable, as if the night's horrors were just a figment of my imagination. But the memory of those eyes, that twisted form, was indelible. I knew what I had to do. The stone, the ancient stone I had found, and against my better judgment, taken, was connected to this creature, this stalker. I had to return it, to put things right, to end this nightmare. With a resolve forged in terror, I packed up my camp for the last time. Today, I would return the stone to its rightful place, to the mysterious grave in the heart of the forest. It was a desperate plan, but it was all I had. The journey back was a blur, driven by a single purpose. I had to appease whatever I had disturbed, to make amends for my intrusion into this ancient, haunted wilderness. With the first light of dawn breaking through the dense canopy, I set out with the ancient stone securely wrapped in my backpack. My mind was consumed with thoughts of last night's encounter, the fear it instilled still fresh and palpable. Each step I took was heavy, not just with the physical weight of my pack, but with the burden of what I had to do. As I retraced my path back to the stone arrangement, the forest seemed less menacing in the daylight. The sinister whispers of the night were gone, replaced by the morning calls of birds and the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Yet the memory of the twisted figure haunted me, urging me to quicken my pace. Arriving at the clearing where I had first found the stone, I paused, taking in the eerie stillness of the place. It looked untouched, as if the forest itself had held its breath since I'd last been there. With a trembling hand, I removed the stone from my pack and approached the central arrangement. Placing the stone back in its original position felt like a ritual, each movement deliberate and filled with a sense of purpose. I half expected the air to shift, the forest to react, but there was only silence. Standing back, I felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Had I done enough to appease whatever forces I had disturbed? As I stood there, contemplating my next move, the air around me began to change. The earlier chill dissipated, replaced by a warmer, gentler breeze that rustled the leaves with what sounded almost like a sigh of relief. It was as if the forest itself was acknowledging my gesture, the return of the stone restoring a balance I had unwittingly upset. With the stone back in place, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The oppressive feeling of being watched, the sense of impending danger, seemed to lessen with each passing minute. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to feel the sun warm my face, and to appreciate the quiet normalcy that seemed to have returned to the wilderness. Yet, I knew I couldn't linger. The need to leave, to put distance between myself and these haunted woods, was urgent. I packed up my belongings and mounted my bike, casting one last look at the stone arrangement. The place now seemed just a part of the landscape, no longer a source of dread. As I cycled away, the forest no longer felt like a prison. The paths were just paths, the trees just trees. The haunting was behind me, both physically and spiritually. My journey back to civilization was quiet, the only sounds those of nature and my own steady breathing. Reaching the outskirts of Aberfoyle village felt surreal. The familiar sights and sounds of human habitation were a stark contrast to the isolation of the past days. I had returned as someone changed, tempered by fear and a confrontation with the unknown. I knew I would never forget the eyes that watched from the darkness, the twisted figure in the clearing, but I had faced them, and I had survived. The return to my starting point marked the end of my journey, but the experiences would linger, a haunting echo of the wild and mysterious Scottish Highlands. I was safe, back in the realm of the known, but part of me would always remain out there, in the deep, dark heart of the woods. Rolling into Aberfoyle village on weary legs, the familiar sights of quaint cottages and the local pub were a stark contrast to the wild, untamed nature I had just left behind. My bike seemed to move on its own accord, each turn of the pedal bringing me closer to a reality I had almost forgotten. The faces of people I passed seemed alien, a reminder of how isolated I had truly been. I stopped in front of my flat, dismounting with a stiffness that spoke of long days in the saddle and sleepless nights on the hard ground. My reflection in the window was that of a man who had gone through a trial by fire, or in my case, by shadow and stone. My eyes were tired, my beard unkempt, but it was the look behind my eyes that told the real story, a mix of relief and residual fear. Stepping inside, the comforts of home felt both foreign and overwhelmingly welcome. I dropped my gear with a clatter, each piece a reminder of the ordeal I had endured. The hot shower that followed was a baptism, washing away the grime, and I hoped, some of the darker memories that clung to me like the mud on my boots. The water ran down the drain. So too did the sharp edges of my fear begin to dull. The creature, the woods, the haunting, they seemed now like parts of a distant nightmare, fragments of a story told around a campfire, rather than memories of the past week. Yet every sound from the street below, every shadow cast by the setting sun, brought a flicker of apprehension. That evening, I ventured out to the local pub, a place where I had always felt at ease. The warm glow of the lights, the murmur of familiar voices, it was all so normal. As I sat with a pint in hand, the locals came to greet me, their curiosity clear. "Ian, back from your adventure then. How were the wilds of Scotland?" I smiled, the corners of my mouth turning up with more effort than usual. "Wild as ever," I replied. "The Highlands are no place for the faint of heart." But I kept the true extent of my experiences to myself. How could I explain the unexplainable? How could I share the terror of being stalked by something that defied description? The questions came, as I knew they would. Did you see any wildlife? Find any hidden trails? Each inquiry was a reminder of what I had encountered, but I deflected with tales of stormy weather and the beauty of the sunrise over the mountains. The creature, the eyes in the dark, those were parts of the story I held close, a secret shared only between me and the wilderness. As the night drew on, I found comfort in the laughter and the clinking of glasses. The normalcy of life in Aberfoyle was a balm to my rattled nerves. Yet every time the door opened, letting in a gust of wind, I tensed, half expecting the shadows to spill inside. Returning home later, the streets empty and the night quiet, I felt a kinship with the darkness I hadn't felt before. The shadows weren't just a source of fear anymore. They were also a reminder of what I had overcome. I was no longer just a man who had ventured into the wilderness. I was a survivor of it. As I lay in bed that night, the comforts of my own room around me, the journey felt both close and distant. The fear, the adrenaline, the confrontation, they were all behind me now. But the echoes of the forest, the sense of being watched, I knew they would linger. I had returned to civilization, but part of me would always remain out there, in the deep, dark heart of the Scottish wilderness.